Okay, welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion today about the interwar period, what's going on between the two wars. And yesterday we had gotten into the Russian Revolution, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and we started talking about colonial Great Britain and the crown jewel of the empire, India, and that's where I kind of left off. So that's where I'll pick up today. So whereas Turkey was fighting off attempts at colonization by the victorious powers of World War I, Indians in the interwar period had to contend with colonialism that had been established in prior centuries. Prior to World War I, India had been increasingly ruled by the British Crown, who wrested power over India from the declining British East India Company. The British ruled with paternalist views that insulted the intelligence of Indians and Indian society. It wasn't like the white man's burden in Africa, where you went there and these people had lived in small tribal societies that you may in some way be able to consider backwards. India had a rich cultural tradition of a civilization, and the British were treating them though like they were just backwards peoples. So the British believed that through their rule they could educate and modernize Indians using anachronistic Western principles until Indians could rule themselves via European-style institutions and government. In reality, England exerted strong and at times violent control over India because of the great economic profit the English made off the colony. India provided a market for British goods while simultaneously providing cheap goods for the rest of the empire. Intellectual resistance to colonialism began in India with the institution of the Indian National Congress in 1885. In its early years, the Indian National Congress argued against the narrow-minded view of the ruling British that Indians were incapable of ruling themselves. In the early 20th century, the Congress grew a large following, not just within the intellectual and upper classes that began it, but all across all portions of Indian society. And while it gained widespread support, opinions as to how to best redress their grievances varied widely. Some wanted to work through the existing system to oppose British rule. Others wanted a violent uprising, and still others had their own unique plans. And this is where one of the greatest figures in world history came into play, and that was Mahatma Gandhi. He was probably the most influential man of the movement for independence from British rule. Gandhi was born in India, but he'd been a law clerk and human rights activist in South Africa before returning to India during World War I. Upon his return, he became a vocal critic of the British government and encouraged peaceful uprisings across the Indian subcontinent in the 1920s. The British responded to these uprisings, though, as while they were peaceful, with violence and violent suppression, including a massacre of hundreds of peaceful protesters in Amritsar in 1919. For fomenting rebellion, however peaceful his demonstrations may have been, Gandhi was imprisoned in 1922. Gandhi was released from prison only 2 years later and returned to his work throwing off the shackles of British rule, though most of his work directly after his release concerned reconciling the Indian subcontinent's Muslim and Hindu communities to one another so that they would be unified in this approach. In 1930, he led a march to the sea in protest of the new British salt tax. And in 1931, he attended the Round Table Conference in London with the hopes of securing greater freedoms for Indians. And this is where he was famously asked, "What do you think about Western civilization?" And he said, "It would be a good idea." So though Gandhi's goal of a free India would not be recognized until 1947 after World War II, his work and use of nonviolent protests are often considered the greatest contributions to Indian independence. I'm going to stop here just for a second because I may be experiencing a technical difficulty, and I just want to make sure, because normally they changed the operating system on Zoom. Normally my video of me shows up and it is not, and so I just wanted to be sure that it was. And also got another technical problem with them, that there are 13 people ahead of me apparently to talk about. That's okay. I started at 345 people ahead of me, so we're doing good. All right, so that's what's going on in India. But something bigger on the horizon is going to stop everything in its tracks and make them secondary, tertiary concerns in the world, and that is the Great Depression. And we're all familiar probably with stories of the Great Depression, but what exactly caused the Great Depression? Rarely in history does an event come along that affects the entire world the way the Great Depression did. Sure, there are big wars and big movements like World War I or the rise of Marxism, but usually you can still find relatively secluded countries that are barely affected by these events. Usually it takes something massive from nature, like a volcanic eruption that spews billions of tons of earth cooling particulates into the air, for an event to have a truly global impact. But one of the few times man-made events have had such a profound impact on the entire Western world was the Wall Street collapse of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, prior to the Great Depression and the Wall Street collapse, the United States experienced one of the most prosperous times in the nation's history. The 1920s, nicknamed the Roaring '20s, was a time of economic success and a relaxing of social codes throughout the country. Women experienced increased liberties, like finally achieving the right to vote, also known as suffrage, and the ability to express and enjoy themselves in the public sphere. Now, this latter freedom was symbolized effectively by the flapper-style dress that you saw all over the place. If you watch the Great Gatsby, and I believe in one of the English classes they show that film, you kind of know what I'm talking about. Jazz music also became popular across the country, especially in speakeasies, underground bars forced to serve liquor illegally in the United States and privately because they had passed a constitutional amendment to ban alcohol sales, known as prohibition. Additionally, the 1920s saw the first major boom in consumer culture. New household amenities like early refrigerators, electric lighting, and automobiles became must-have items that people were now able to take home immediately and pay for later using the expanding credit industry. Now, the heights to which 1920 society climbed worsened the impact of the economic ruin of the following decade. Moreover, much of this prosperity was built upon the shaky legs of risky financial practices, which precipitated the collapse. Indeed, many of the stores offering these new items, like automobiles and refrigerators, offered their own forms of credit at high interest to consumers. And when consumers began failing to make payments, the businesses were forced to eat that loss and sometimes even close down as a result. In addition, banks were lending money without safeguards against financial crises. They were lending out huge sums of money and using customer deposits to do so, which means you go to the bank with your $100 paycheck, you put it in the bank, they're giving that, they're turning right around as soon as you put it in the bank and loaning it to someone to build a new factory. So that when the factory went under, you went to get your $100 from the bank, it wasn't there. So furthermore, they were accepting those same customer deposits without any guarantees that their money would be immediately available to them in the future. Additionally, stock market speculation played a huge role in precipitating the economic collapse. Speculation on the market by savvy financiers had artificially inflated the prices of large portions of the stock market. And moreover, much of the money being tossed around in the market was increasingly made up of the savings of the growing American middle class. And speculation has to do with borrowing money. So you go to the bank and say, listen, I think that this stock is going to go up. I want to invest in this factory. I want to borrow $100,000 from you to do it. Well, they go into your bank, they go into your neighbor's bank account, pull that money out to give it to you. All of a sudden, it's wasted. Your money now, your neighbor now has no money. So this economic house of cards came tumbling down on October 28th, 1929, a day which was infamously named Black Monday. Several economic indicators pointed to a possible collapse at that time. For example, in 1926, the housing market in Florida collapsed and land speculators in the state were ruined. People who had bought lots of empty swampland because they thought they could sell it at high prices. In addition, banks that had loaned out too much capital were beginning to fall in 1929, and food prices were beginning to fall, ruining farmers who had produced a vast amount of food to sell at the artificially inflated prices of the 1920s. When the opening bell rang on Wall Street on October 28th, stock prices immediately began to tumble. So many stocks were sold so quickly that many day traders were, sorry, I had to check and see. I thought I heard, I have it set to have a chime, but I thought I heard something on there. So many stocks were sold so quickly that many traders were forced to work through the night to simply record all the stocks which had been traded. And by the end of the day, the Dow Jones had dropped 13%. The following day, stock prices continued to plummet, dropping another 12%. By November, the market had hit rock bottom, wiping out many middle-class investors' life savings. Now, the ensuing panic caused even more economic ruin, as those still with deposits and savings accounts and other bank products rushed to the bank to withdraw their money. Most banks ran out of cash on hand in hours and were forced to turn customers away, telling them their life savings had vanished in a matter of hours. Internationally, the collapse spread outward from the United States with alarming speed. The US government and US banks were owed huge sums of money by European countries who had received large loans during World War I and afterward to aid the reconstruction of the war-torn continent. And when the government and banks called in many of these loans soon after the collapse, the European banking system collapsed with the same rapidity that the US system had collapsed. The scenes that occurred in front of bank doors in the United States were soon played out in Madrid, London, Paris. And the economic collapse that occurred after the Wall Street market collapse of 1929 affected all sectors of the country and aspects of society. Unemployment skyrocketed nationally to approximately 25%, leaving 1 in 4 men out of work, and it rose far higher in some regions. And that's when people, particularly veterans who had been promised a bond that they could cash in 25 years as part of their military payment, they marched on Washington and they decided to just stay there and protest until they're paid. And they developed these little cardboard shanties and things that, and where they were known as Hoovervilles because of President Herbert Hoover, who was office in the time of the collapse. And these Hoovervilles began springing up all over the country. These were shanty towns along the banks of rivers where families who had emerged from the collapse penniless and unemployed lived. Millions of Americans picked up what few belongings they had and traveled the country looking for work from town to town. And though things got marginally better with the New Deal policies of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected in 1932, the country did not truly get out of the Depression until it entered World War II in 1941.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I don't see the slides.
Okay, I'm sorry. I apologize for that.
That's okay.
There, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. So a time-honored idiom states that out of crisis comes opportunity. Well, you'd be hard-pressed to find a much bigger crisis than the Great Depression experienced in the 1930s by the United States and Western Europe. As most of the world fell on hard economic times, some Western economists viewed it as an opportunity to attempt far-reaching fiscal and social programs in an attempt to get the world's economy back on its feet, while others preferred isolating their countries in an attempt to stop the pain. The Great Depression struck in 1929 and lasted in varying degrees up until World War II, when large sectors of the economy were put back to work producing goods and products for the war effort. Now, there certainly is an argument also whether it was the money we spent producing these things or the money people couldn't spend anymore because we were only producing wartime products. And that's a great debate among economists. So the burden of deciding how to care for those affected by the swift and immense economic downturn fell largely to the Western governments. In the United States, the government initially implemented a string of isolationist policies aimed at closing the US off from the international community. And this did little to alleviate the problems, and matters only got worse in the first few years of the Depression, likely costing Herbert Hoover his reelection bid. When Hoover's opponent, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, took office in January 1933, he immediately focused his attention on the US economy, taking the United States off the gold standard, which meant that all US dollars had to be tied to a certain amount of gold, if you recall, in order to allow more currency into circulation. And I say, if you recall, I was talking about that in economics here recently. So if you're not in economics, you probably won't recall that. Now, this would likely cause long-term inflation problems, but in the short term, it would put more money into the alien US marketplace. Roosevelt also instituted a host of public work projects, financing the new agencies with government money in order to put Americans back to work and build the country's infrastructure at the same time. Sorry, I skipped one. There were so many new agencies with such varied acronyms: the WPA, the Workers' Progress Administration; the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation; the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission; the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, that commentators began calling them Roosevelt's alphabet soup agencies. In foreign trade, Roosevelt re-engaged the U.S. economy with foreign powers. He created the Import-Export Bank to regulate U.S. trade with foreign countries. And furthermore, he made it easier for foreign countries to trade with the U.S. by signing reciprocal trade agreements with 19 nations in the 1930s alone, from countries and economies as small as Honduras to countries as large as Great Britain. Now, many of the same initial policies that the United States instituted were undertaken elsewhere in the Western world as well. If, for instance, Great Britain went off the gold standard even before the US in 1931. British policy immediately after the beginning of the Depression was as isolationist as the United States, as Britain looked to protect its own industries. And this had the unintended effect, though, of harming the UK's manufacturing industry, already reeling from the massive fall in British exports corresponding to the international economic downturn. Their market shrank, in other words. So protectionist tariffs further hurt the orders these sectors of the economy got from foreign countries, because it raised the price of getting those goods from foreign countries. Should be noted, however, that the Great Depression's effect on Great Britain was far more regional than in the United States. The north of England, which relied heavily on manufacturing and industry, was hurt far worse by the Great Depression, whereas in the Midlands and in the South, recovery from the Depression came much quicker than in either the North or in the United States. France, unlike Great Britain and the US, held on steadfastly to the gold standard. And although France experienced less of an economic depression than in either the US or Great Britain, its effects were felt for a longer period of time due to this refusal to abandon basing their currency on a finite amount of gold. So while riots occurred in manufacturing heavy regions of the country, a lot of protectionist measures were already in place in France, which lessened the overall effect of the Depression. But just as in the US, it did take World War II to eventually sweep away the economic downturn in France as well. So now that we've kind of understood the causes of the Great Depression and what's happened there, we're going to look towards Asia and what's going there, especially the Eastern Asia now, because remember, part of World War II, especially drawing the United States in, comes from this region as well. So we'll look at conflicts in interwar Asia. Most group of friends that you have, if you're having a bad day, they won't call you out on it and kick you when you're down, basically. For example, when your buddy loses his job, the last thing you do is make fun of him. Well, someone forgot to tell that to Japan in the early 20th century. And indeed, rather than pick up its neighbor China and dust off his shoulders for him, Japan exploited the weakness and internal strife of China to aggressively invade Chinese territory. So prior to the mid-19th century, you might recall, Japan had been closed to any foreign travelers or traders. And the xenophobic policy that had been in place since the early 17th century was extreme. Stories emerged of shipwrecked sailors from Western Europe being killed just for washing up on the island's nation's shores. And if you bear with me for a second here, I'm going to go and look and see where I am on this so that I don't miss out, because I've been waiting quite a long time. Okay, so bear with me. They're talking to me now. I'm going to ask me something. Okay, I typed in something, so bear with me here. We're going to go back. I'll have to flip back and forth, and I apologize, but when I started, I was number 345 in line, so I've been waiting a long time, and I don't feel like waiting anymore to get this technical issue with Zoom resolved, so I can start publishing these videos a little quicker. So I apologize for that. So this xenophobic policy changed in the 1850s when an American fleet led by Commodore Matthew Perry forced the Tokugawa shogunate, which ruled Japan, to sign treaties that opened its ports to foreign trade. You may recall us talking about that in the last unit. Now, the ensuing flood of foreign cash into the Japanese market exacerbated pre-existing economic problems, and the Tokugawa government fell shortly after. It was replaced by the first Meiji emperor, and the powerful nobles who surrounded him intended to modernize and industrialize Japan as quickly as possible. In relatively short order, railroads crisscrossed the island nation, and Japan's shipping industry, which is virtually non-existent due to the laws against foreign trade, rose dramatically. As quickly as Japan industrialized, the country began looking to expand its foreign influence. For one, they needed the natural resources that you couldn't get on the small islands of Japan in order to fund this industrialization to fuel it. In 1894, Japan fought a 2-year conflict with China, which freed the Korean peninsula from Chinese control and opened Chinese ports to Japanese trade. 10 years later, Japan went to war again, this time against the encroaching Russian presence in Manchuria. And victorious again, Japan gained protectorate status over the Korean peninsula and forced Russia out of Chinese land. By the time World War I broke out in 1914, Japan was looking to extend its influence into China proper, while Europe was occupied elsewhere. So in 1915, they presented China with 21 demands. And though not all the demands were recognized, Japan gained protectorate status and effective rule over large areas of northern China, including Manchuria and Inner Mongolia, as well as economic interests in Chinese state-owned mining operations. I apologize, I heard the little sound that they answered me. We're going to go back and forth here, and I apologize. Oh, all they said was 1 sec. All right, big help, thank you. All right, so as they also wanted economic interests in Chinese state-owned mining operations, and as part of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Japan further gained the rights to Germany's sphere of influence in China's Shandong province. Now, as one might guess, the developments just discussed, as Japan's star rose in the international sky, the power and clout of the Chinese state was falling in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The 19th century saw China's long period of stability under the Ming Dynasty interrupted by the arrival of Western powers. And though several conflicts that the Chinese were ill prepared to fight, Western powers carved out of China economic spheres of influence, regions that were still under nominal Chinese control, but whose economic profits were largely shaved off by foreign Western European powers. And the reaction to the humiliation caused by this blatant foreign incursion into Chinese lands, nationalist sentiment grew within China, often calling for China to self-strengthen from within. This anti-foreigner movement was best exemplified by the Boxer Uprising or Boxer Rebellion in 1900. In the uprising, Chinese nationalists spread across northern China, murdering foreigners and missionaries, and eventually laying siege to the foreign-controlled cities of Beijing and Tianjin. The rebellion was brutally put down by a group of Western allies, including the United States, who had troops there, and most of northern China was occupied by Western troops afterwards. A 1911 revolution in China installed a republican form of government. After World War I, internal Chinese politics saw an internal power struggle between the Republican nationalists and the growing Soviet-supported Chinese Communist Party. After an attempted kidnapping of the nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek, in 1926, Chiang imposed severe restrictions on communist activities, although Communist Underground was slowly growing support in the rural areas in the countryside. A librarian and devoted communist from Beijing, Mao Zedong, was slowly building Soviet-style enclaves in rural China and recruiting a guerrilla force. The country remained largely under nationalist control for the next decade, and Chiang Kai-shek spent numerous resources sending the nationalist army on campaigns in northern China against the communists. Chiang's constant campaigns toward rooting out Chinese communism forced Mao to lead his followers on the infamous Long March, a very important thing in Chinese communist history, in 1934, where approximately 100,000 Communist Party members fled some 12,500 kilometers, and only about 8,000 making it to the final destination, to Shaanxi province. So while Chiang chased Mao's communists, and there was basically a civil war in China around the interior of the country, to the east loomed the continuous presence of an expansionary and increasingly militaristic Japan. And indeed, Japan was not content merely with its control of the Crimean Peninsula and influence in Shandong province. So in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria and set up a puppet Chinese government under Japanese control. And through the League of Nations in Western Europe, they condemned Japan's seizure of Manchuria. There was little they could do to aid China. And I mean, they had problems of their own. The 1929 Wall Street collapse, the Great Depression, left most Western states incapable of paying for military intervention in China. Japanese troops pushed south from Manchuria, taking control of territory along China's east coast. And in 1937, under considerable pressure from the Chinese public, Chiang Kai-shek interrupted his campaign against the communists to meet the invading Japanese forces. And the nationalists and communists even signed a pact to fight together against the Japanese, but this coalition quickly broke down. Japan continued to gain in territory in northern and eastern China, ruthlessly treating the Chinese people that they governed. The rape of Nanking, for example, which is celebrated every year as a day of remembrance in China. It happened in December 1937, saw Japanese troops rape, loot, murder, and pillage throughout the Chinese capital of Nanking for several weeks. Historians' best rough estimates claim approximately 250,000 Chinese people lost their lives in the incident, though numbers concerning this event in particular are highly contested. The Japanese will claim less, the Chinese actually claim a lot more. So the failures of the nationalist government in defending China against Japanese incursions led to the growth of the Chinese Communist Party, who had continued operating in rural China outside the scope and reach of either the nationalists or the Japanese invaders. During World War II, party membership rose exponentially, rising up to 1.2 million members in 1945. And that's where I'll stop today. Did you have any questions?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, we'll hopefully see you tomorrow then.
Yes. Have a good day.
You too.